Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into a really incredible period of change, a time when basically everything people thought they knew about health, about disease, it just got completely turned on its head.
Absolutely. And if you're gearing up for your AQA GCSE History Paper 2, Section A, the health and the people's topic, well, this deep dive is definitely for you.
Yeah, we've tailored this one. We're focusing on the 19th and the early 20th centuries, mainly in Britain.
That's right. And our mission, if you like, is to unpack this whole era. We want to look at the really vital breakthroughs, understand the massive challenges people were up against, and sort of explore how thinking about illness, making surgery safer, even improving the health of whole towns and cities, how it all transformed.
It really did.
Yeah.
I mean, think about where things were at the start. The main ideas about why people got sick were things like miasma, this belief in bad air, bad smells.
Right, like the smell itself was the cause.
Exactly. Or spontaneous generation, this idea that, decaying stuff could just magically create tiny living things, microbes.
Seems bizarre now, doesn't it?
It does. So we're going to trace that journey from that kind of thinking to a proper scientific understanding and see how that knowledge started saving lives, really, on a scale people hadn't seen before.
Okay, so where do we start? I guess the absolute bedrock has to be understanding disease itself, that big breakthrough germ theory.
Yeah, but maybe set the scene first. You mentioned miasma, spontaneous generation. What was the thinking before Pasteur really got going?
Well, miasma was, as you said, super popular. People could see, couldn't they, that where conditions were filthy, where it smelled awful, that's where disease was rife. So blaming bad air seemed illogical.
It's observational, isn't it? You see a link.
Exactly. And you had these scientists, the anti-contagionists, who argued that disease wasn't really spreading person to person. They thought it sort of arose from those bad conditions, triggered by the miasma.
Which, if you don't know about microscopic germs, kind of makes sense in a way.
It does. And spontaneous generation added another layer. Scientists could see tiny things, microbes, with early microscopes. They saw them in decaying stuff.
So they thought the decay made the microbes.
Pretty much. The idea was that the decay itself created them, and then these things spread, perhaps via the miasma. It was all linked, based on what they could see, but missing that crucial piece.
Right. So how did we get from that to understanding germs properly? Who cracked it?
Well, the big name here is Louis Pasteur, French chemist working in the 1860s. He actually got involved because of a scientific competition specifically to prove or disprove spontaneous generation.
Ah, okay. And his experiments were quite neat, weren't they?
They're brilliant. He used these special swan neck flasks. Air could get in, but any dust particles, any microbes in the air got trapped in the bin.
Clever.
And he showed that if you boiled the liquid inside to sterilize it, nothing grew. But if you broke the neck or tipped the flask so the liquid touched the trapped dust, microbes appeared.
So proving the microbes came from the air, not the liquid itself.
Exactly. He proved air contained microbes, that some air had more than others, and crucially, that heating things up, boiling, killed them off. That finished spontaneous generation as a serious theory.
Okay, so he debunked that. But showing microbes exist is one thing, linking them directly to disease in humans, that's the next step.
It was. And Pasteur started making that connection more explicit around 1870. A key moment was his work on a disease that was wrecking the French silk industry. He identified the specific germ causing the silkworm disease.
Oh, okay. So applying it practically.
Yes, and then he published his ideas on germ theory, properly linking germs to illness in 1878.
And then he went even further, didn't he? Into prevention, vaccines.
That's right. His work on chicken cholera in 1879 is a classic example. He found the germ, but then, apparently by accident, he used an old weakened batch, a weakened culture, to inject some chickens.
What happened?
They got a bit sick, but they didn't die. And the crucial bit was, when he later injected those same chickens with a fresh, deadly batch, they were fine. They were protected.
So the weakened version gave them immunity, like Jenner with cowpox, but now understanding why.
Exactly. He'd worked out the principle, and he went on to develop vaccines for anthrax, a disease affecting sheep and cattle, and famously for rabies, using weakened versions of the germs.
The impact of germ theory, then.
Yeah.
It's hard to exaggerate it, really.
Oh, absolutely massive. It gave the first proper scientific explanation for infectious diseases. It just swept away centuries of guesswork about miasma or curses or imbalances.
And it proved those anti-contagionists wrong. Diseases are caused by tiny living things, and yes, they can spread.
Which then obviously points directly towards needing better hygiene, developing more vaccines, rethinking public health entirely, even if it took a while for everyone to accept it.
Definitely. So Pasteur lays this incredible foundation, but then Robert Koch comes along. What did he add?
Well, Koch, a German scientist, really built on Pasteur's work. Pasteur showed that germs cause disease. Koch's mission was to pinpoint the specific germ responsible for each specific disease.
And they weren't exactly best buddies, were they? There was a bit of rivalry.
Oh, huge rivalry. Fueled by national competition between France and Germany, actually. Both governments were funding their work. It sort of spurred them on.
Right. So what was Koch's big contribution, method-wise?
His genius was in developing new methods for studying bacteria in the lab. Before Koch, it was hard to isolate and grow one type of bacteria. He figured out how to grow them in pure cultures.
Using things like agar jelly. I remember that from school science.
Exactly. Using agar jelly derived from seaweed provided a solid surface they could grow on visibly. And he developed ways to stain bacteria with chemical dyes, making them much easier to see and identify under the microscope.
That must have changed everything for researchers.
Totally revolutionized bacteriology. And using these techniques, he made some massive discoveries really quickly. In 1882, he identified the specific bacterium that causes tuberculosis TB, a huge killer at the time.
Wow. And cholera, too.
Yes, in 1883, he found the cholera bacterium. And then, crucially, in 1884, he proved scientifically that cholera was spread through contaminated water.
Which must have been massive, because as we'll get into, John Snow had figured that out observationally decades earlier.
Exactly. Snow had shown it with his Broad Street pump work, but Koch provided the actual scientific proof by identifying the bacterium in the water. It nailed it.
So Koch's work supports Snow. It supports Jenner's earlier vaccine work by finding the actual bugs.
And it inspired a whole generation. Scientists suddenly had the tools and the method to go hunting for the bacteria causing other diseases, diphtheria, plague, typhoid, making them potentially preventable. Paul Ehrlich, who we'll talk about later with magic bullets, was one of Koch's students.
He got the Nobel Prize, didn't he?
He did. Absolutely fundamental work.
Okay, so we've got Pasteur proving germs cause disease, Koch identifying specific germs and how to study them. You'd think Britain would just immediately go, right, this is it, and adopt germ theory overnight.
You would think so, wouldn't you? But no, not really. It actually faced quite a bit of resistance, certainly at first.
Why?
Well, spontaneous generation was still quite a popular idea in Britain into the 1870s. And you had respected, influential doctors like Dr. Henry Bastian, who publicly argued against germ theory in medical journals.
So doctors themselves were skeptical.
Some of the most influential ones were, and the public, tended to trust their doctors. Plus, the old miasma idea, blaming bad smells, just seemed more intuitive, maybe. Easier to grasp than invisible microbes floating around.
Right, you can smell the problem with miasma.
Mm-hmm.
But surely there were people in Britain championing these new ideas.
Oh, yes, absolutely. There were key figures. John Tyndall, a physicist, actually did experiments showing links between dust particles in the air and germs, but because he wasn't a doctor, many medics kind of ignored him.
The professional silos.
Exactly. But Joseph Lister, the surgeon, he was absolutely crucial. He saw the potential of germ theory for preventing infection in surgery very early on.
We'll definitely come back to him. Who else?
There was William Roberts, a physician who did his own work disproving spontaneous generation and really backed Lister up. And William Chain, who worked closely with Lister, translated Koch's important work into English, making it accessible.
That's important.
Very. And Chain also showed that not all bacteria found in wounds were actually harmful, adding a bit more nuance. So acceptance grew, but it was gradual. It took the weight of evidence from Pasteur and Koch, the practical proof from people like Lister, and the efforts of these British supporters pushing against the doubters.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's pivot to surgery then. You mentioned Lister. Before all this germ stuff, before anesthetics even, surgery must have been, well, terrifying.
Terrifying and incredibly limited. Pain and shock were huge killers. Patients often died just from the trauma of the operation itself. Surgeons had to be unbelievably fast. We're talking amputations in minutes or even seconds. Anything complex was just impossible.
So finding a way to knock patients out safely in anesthetic was absolutely vital.
Desperately needed. There were early attempts. Humphrey Davy discovered nitrous oxide laughing gas back around 1800. Good for maybe pulling a tooth, but not much else.
And ether. I've heard of that being used.
Yes, an American doctor, Crawford Long, used ether successfully. It caused a real buzz because it offered deeper, longer-lasting pain relief. But it had big problems. Patients often vomited, it irritated their lungs badly, and worst of all, it was highly flammable.
Flammable.
Yeah.
In an operating theater probably lit by gas lamps. That sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
Exactly. A massive risk. So the hunt was on for something better. Which brings us to James Simpson, a Scottish doctor in Edinburgh.
Right. Simpson and chloroform. What's the story there?
Well, Simpson was actively searching, and the story goes, in 1847, he and a couple of friends were literally sitting around his dining table, trying out inhaling various chemicals to see it happen.
Seriously, just sniffing random chemicals. Sounds a bit dangerous.
It does, doesn't it? But apparently, they tried chloroform, and all promptly passed out under the table. They woke up realizing they'd found something powerful.
Wow. Okay, so chloroform. What was its impact? Mostly positive.
A real mixed bag, actually. On the plus side, it was generally more effective and easier to use than ether. And crucially, Queen Victoria used it during childbirth in 1853.
That must have been huge for public acceptance.
Massive. If it was good enough for the Queen, Simpson was knighted for it. And here's a key point. Because patients were unconscious, surgeons could now attempt longer, more complicated operations. They could take more time.
This is good.
It was, in one way, but it highlighted another massive problem: infection. Longer operations meant more time for germs to get in, so solving the pain problem actually made the infection problem more urgent.
Ah, that's a really interesting link. One advance creating the need for the next. What were the downsides of chloroform itself?
Big ones. It was actually quite easy to overdose a patient. The dosage was tricky to control. The tragic death of a young girl, Hannah Greener, during a toenail operation really highlighted this danger.
Yeah.
It was. And it could also affect the heart, sometimes causing sudden death, especially in younger people. Plus, as we said, longer surgeries meant more bleeding, more chance of infection afterwards. And there were even religious objections, people arguing that pain, especially in childbirth, was God's will.
Right, so a vital step, but not the final answer for pain relief.
Definitely not. It fell out of favor mostly by the 20th century, but it bridged a crucial gap.
Okay, so pain is being tackled, but as you said, this makes the infection problem even starker. What was surgical hygiene like before Lister?
Non-existent, basically. Horrifying by our standards. Operating theaters often weren't cleaned between operations. Surgeons might operate in their ordinary street clothes.
What? No gowns, no mask.
Nothing like that. They didn't wash their hands, didn't clean their instruments properly. In fact, an apron stiff with dried blood and pus was sometimes seen as a badge of honor, showed you were experienced.
Oh, that's grim.
It really was. Unsurprisingly, death rates from postoperative infections, things like gangrene, sepsis, or blood poisoning, were incredibly high. Maybe up to 50% in some hospitals after amputations.
So infection was almost expected, and this is where Joseph Lister comes in, inspired by Pasteur.
Exactly. Lister, another Scottish surgeon working in Glasgow, he read Pasteur's work showing germs cause decay, like wine going bad. And he made the connection. He thought the rotting he saw in infected wounds must be caused by germs too.
So if germs caused it, maybe something could kill the germs.
That was his thinking.
Yeah.
He knew about carbolic acid. It was already being used, funnily enough, to treat sewage in Carlisle and cut down the smell, partly because it killed bacteria.
Right, so you thought maybe use it on wounds.
Precisely. Starting around 1865, he began treating patients with compound fractures where the bone breaks the skin, a very high infection risk, by soaking bandages in carbolic acid solution and applying them directly after setting the bone.
And did it work?
Dramatically. Wounds that would almost certainly have become infected and led to amputation or death started healing cleanly. He also developed a spray to pump a mist of carbolic acid into the air around the patient during the operation.
Trying to kill airborne germs.
Yes. He published his results in the Lancet Medical Journal, reporting on 11 successful cases. It was revolutionary.
What was the impact? Did everyone adopt it immediately?
Not immediately. Like germ theory itself, there was resistance. Some surgeons found it fiddly, messy. The acid smelled unpleasant. It irritated the skin on their hands.
Which actually led to rubber gloves being developed later, didn't it? Because the acid was so harsh.
That's right, an unintended consequence. And some surgeons just didn't really believe the underlying germ science yet.
Yeah.
But the results spoke for themselves. Death rates from infection plummeted where Lister's methods were used properly. It slowly changed attitudes about the absolute need for cleanliness.
And it paved the way for something even better, right?
Yeah.
Aseptic surgery.
Yes, that's the crucial next step. Lister's method was antiseptic, using chemicals to kill germs on the wound or instruments.
Whereas aseptic surgery.
Aseptic surgery, which really developed towards 1900, is about preventing germs from getting near the wound in the first place, creating a completely sterile environment. Using sterilized instruments, often with steam heat, sterile gowns, gloves, masks, cleaning the theater rigorously, aiming for germ-free conditions from the start.
So Lister stopped using the carbolic spray eventually.
Yes, by about 1890, as aseptic techniques became more refined and understood. But his antiseptic principle was the vital bridge. It proved that controlling germs dramatically improved surgical survival.
Incredible. So we've seen huge changes in understanding disease, in making surgery survivable. What about the health of the general population? This is all happening during the Industrial Revolution, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's a massive factor in the story of public health in this period. Britain was changing incredibly fast, moving from farming to factories.
People flooding into towns and cities for work. Places like Manchester, Birmingham, London.
Exactly. Huge migrations. And these towns just grew uncontrollably, incredibly rapidly. Housing was thrown up, cheap, back-to-back terraces, often with no planning, no sanitation.
Meaning no clean water piped in, no proper sewers, no rubbish collection.
Often, yes. Houses were damp, poorly ventilated, overcrowded. Streets were often unpaved, covered in rubbish, animal dung, human waste from overflowing privies or just thrown out. Perfect conditions for diseases to spread like wildfire.
Things like cholera, typhoid, TB.
Precisely. Life expectancy in the worst parts of cities was shocking. In Liverpool in 1841, the average age of death for a laborer was just 15. Even for professionals, it was only 35. The overall average in cities was maybe 40, much lower than in the countryside.
And yet, despite this really obvious link between the filth and the disease, most people still blamed.
Miasma. The bad air, the foul smells rising from the filth. Even many scientists and doctors clung to that idea.
So efforts focused on, what, clearing smells rather than clearing the waste itself?
Often, yes, or just not doing anything. Because the other huge factor was the government's attitude, especially early in the 19th century. It was very laissez-faire. Basically, leave it alone or allow to do. The prevailing political idea was that the government shouldn't interfere in people's lives or in industry or the economy. Improving housing or sanitation wasn't seen as their responsibility. It was up to individuals or local parishes.
Which clearly wasn't working in these massive growing cities.
Not at all. And this is the context for the next crucial story. John Snow and his work on cholera.
Right, cholera. A really terrifying disease for people back then. When did it arrive?
It hit Britain in waves, started around 1831, probably coming from India via trade routes. It caused violent sickness and diarrhea, leading to rapid dehydration and often death within hours or days. Huge epidemics swept the country roughly every 10 years or so.
And it hit the poorest areas hardest, presumably, the slums.
Yes, exactly where the sanitation and water supplies were worst. But remember, the dominant theory was miasma, bad air. So people tried cleaning the streets to reduce the smell, but ignored the water supplies.
Until John Snow came along. He wasn't just any doctor, was he?
No, he was actually a very well-respected surgeon and a pioneer anesthetist. He's the one who gave Queen Victoria chloroform during childbirth, and he lived right in Soho in London.
So he saw the effects of cholera firsthand.
He did, and during the 1848-49 epidemic, he started developing his own theory. He published a booklet called On the Mode of Communication of Cholera.
And what did he argue?
He argued that miasma theory was wrong. Cholera affected the guts, the stomach, first not the lungs, as you'd expect if it was airborne. He proposed it must be swallowed, probably through drinking water contaminated by the feces, the waste of other cholera victims.
That must have sounded radical then, going against the miasma idea. Did he have proof?
Not definitive scientific proof at that stage, just strong reasoning and observation. The proof came during the next big London outbreak in 1854, which hit his own neighborhood, Soho, particularly hard. Hundreds died very quickly.
And this is where he did his famous investigation.
Yes, he did something brilliant. He got a map of the Soho area and marked a dot for every single cholera death.
A spot map. What did it show?
A really clear pattern. The deaths were overwhelmingly clustered around one particular public water pump, the Broad Street pump.
So he suspected the pump.
He did. He went further. He interviewed families of the dead. He found people living closer to other pumps who hadn't got sick. They didn't use the Broad Street pump. He found people living far away who had got sick. Turns out they liked the taste of the Broad Street water and sent servants to fetch it.
Building a really strong case.
Absolutely. There was a workhouse nearby with hundreds of inmates, hardly any cholera cases. They had their own well. A brewery right on Broad Street. Workers drank beer mainly again, hardly any cases.
So what did he do?
He went to the local authorities, presented his evidence, and persuaded them to take the handle off the Broad Street pump.
Just remove the handle.
Yes, so people couldn't draw water from it anymore, and the outbreak in that area stopped almost immediately.
Wow, that's decisive. Did they find out why that pump was contaminated?
A later investigation found that the well lining was cracked, and a leaking cesspit, basically an old sewer pit from a nearby house where a baby had died of cholera, was less than 3 feet away, seeping waste into the water supply.
Grim, but clear proof.
Okay.
So Snow's work. What was its significance? Did the government immediately change everything?
Not immediately, no. In the short term, taking the handle off saved lives in Soho, obviously. But the official committee investigating the 1854 outbreak largely dismissed Snow's findings. They still clung to the miasma theory. The evidence wasn't quite strong enough for them, and the prevailing ideas were hard to shift.
So when did things start to change based on his work?
Well, a major trigger for action, ironically still linked to smell, was the Great Stink of 1858.
The Great Stink, what was that?
A hot summer meant the level of the River Thames dropped, exposing decades of untreated sewage that had been dumped into it. The smell was so overpowering, especially around the Houses of Parliament right on the riverbank, that MPs couldn't stand it. Curtains were soaked in chloride of lime.
That must have focused minds.
It certainly did. It finally forced the government into large-scale action on sewage disposal. They hired an engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, to design and build a massive modern sewer system for London.
Bazalgette's sewers, they're still partly in use today, aren't they?
They are an amazing feat of engineering. Over 1,300 miles of sewers built by 1865, intercepting the waste before it got into the Thames and carrying it downstream. This had a huge impact, effectively ending major cholera outbreaks in London, even though the motivation was mostly getting rid of the smell, not necessarily accepting Snow's waterborne theory yet.
And then later, Pasteur's germ theory provided the scientific explanation for how disease spread.
Exactly. Pasteur's work showed germs existed and caused disease, making Snow's idea about contaminated water much more plausible scientifically.
And Koch finished the job, basically.
Pretty much. When Koch identified the actual cholera bacterium in 1883 and then proved in 1884 that it was spread by contaminated water, it completely vindicated Snow's work from 30 years earlier. The scientific proof was finally undeniable.
So long-term, Snow's work, combined with the later science, was absolutely crucial in proving that government had to get involved on public health, providing clean water, dealing with sewage. It wasn't optional.
Precisely. It laid the groundwork for the big public health acts.
Right, let's talk about those. Proving dirty water caused cholera is one thing, but getting nationwide action is another. Campaigners were important here, weren't they?
Hugely important. Public health reformers played a vital role in pushing for change. Edwin Chadwick is a really key name.
Chadwick's report, 1842, wasn't it?
That's the one. The sanitary conditions of the laboring population. It was a landmark report. He used statistics comparing life expectancy in different areas. He showed starkly how much shorter lives were in the filthy, overcrowded industrial cities compared to the countryside.
And he blamed the conditions.
He blamed the filth, the lack of drainage, the bad housing. He argued powerfully that disease was linked to these conditions and that it cost the country money through lost work and supporting widows and orphans. He campaigned for local authorities to be given powers to clean up, provide clean water, remove waste, and set up local boards of health.
Interestingly, though, even Chadwick still believed in miasma, right? He thought the smell from the filth caused the disease.
Yes, he wasn't a germ theory believer. His motivation was cleaning up the environment to get rid of the bad air. But his detailed evidence about the appalling conditions and their impact was incredibly powerful, even if his explanation for why wasn't quite right yet.
Did the government act on his report straight away?
Not really. The laissez-faire attitude was still strong. Vested interests, cost concerns. It took more pressure.
So it finally pushed the government away from laissez-faire. Seems like a combination of things.
It was. Definitely germ theory gaining acceptance provided the scientific why. Snow's work, later proven by Koch, gave concrete evidence about water and cholera. Chadwick and other campaigners kept highlighting the awful conditions and demanding action. And then there was another factor, perhaps a surprising one, the Boer War.
The war in South Africa around the turn of the century, how did that affect public health back home?
Well, when the army tried to recruit soldiers for the war, they found that a huge percentage of men from the industrial cities, maybe up to 40% in some areas, were actually too unhealthy to fight. They were rejected on medical grounds, suffering from diseases linked to poverty, poor diet, bad sanitation like rickets, TB.
Wow. So it became a national security issue.
Exactly. It was a shock. How could Britain maintain its empire if its population wasn't even fit enough to be soldiers? It really drove home the point that the health of the working classes wasn't just a local problem, it was a national concern the government had to address.
Okay, so all these pressures, science, evidence, campaigning, even military concerns led to the Public Health Acts. There was one in 1848.
Yes, the first Public Health Act came in 1848, partly prompted by Chadwick's report and another cholera outbreak. But it was quite weak. It allowed local councils to set up boards of health and make improvements like drainage and water supply, but it didn't force them to.
So it was optional.
Pretty much. Many areas, especially those resistant to spending money, just ignored it, so its impact was limited.
But the 1875 Act was different.
That was the big one. The 1875 Public Health Act made it compulsory for local authorities across the country to take action.
What did they have to do?
They were legally required to appoint a medical officer of health responsible for overseeing public health locally. They had to provide clean water supplies, they had to build and maintain proper sewage systems, and ensure waste disposal didn't pollute water sources. They had to ensure streets were paved and cleaned, provide public toilets, check the quality of food being sold, ensure new houses were built to safer standards, and even provide public parks for recreation.
So a whole raft of measures, and this time they had teeth. There were consequences for not doing it.
Yes, councils could be fined or forced to act by central government if they didn't comply. It marked a fundamental shift. By the late 19th century, the government had finally accepted that public health was its responsibility. The laissez-faire days were largely over in this area.
That 1875 Act feels like a real turning point then.
It absolutely was. Now, it didn't solve everything overnight, of course. Poverty, poor nutrition, diseases like TB that spread in overcrowded housing, these remain huge problems well into the 20th century. But the 1875 Act laid the essential foundations for the public health infrastructure we rely on today. It forced improvements nationwide.
Okay, so we've covered understanding disease, safer surgery, and the beginnings of modern public health. Just briefly, let's touch on the early 20th century and the idea of actually curing diseases with medicine.
Right. Building directly on Pasteur and Koch identifying specific bacteria, the next logical step was trying to find chemicals that could kill those specific bacteria inside the body without harming the patient too much.
The magic bullet idea.
Exactly. A chemical designed to target only the harmful microbe. This was a direct application of germ theory, moving towards treatment.
And the key name here is Paul Ehrlich.
Paul Ehrlich, yes. A German scientist and actually one of Robert Koch's former students, he became obsessed with finding these chemical cures.
And he focused on syphilis.
Yes, syphilis was a major health problem. Widespread, serious long-term effects, and the existing treatments, often involving mercury, were pretty horrible and not very effective. The Boer War recruitment issues had also highlighted how common syphilis was. Ehrlich wanted a specific chemical cure.
How did he go about finding one?
It was incredibly systematic, painstaking work. He decided to test hundreds of compounds based on arsenic. He thought arsenic might kill the syphilis bacteria, but he needed a version that wasn't too poisonous to humans.
So just trial and error, hundreds of times.
Pretty much. By 1907, his team had synthesized and tested over 600 different arsenic compounds. None had worked properly.
600, that's dedication.
It is. But then, in 1909, a Japanese scientist working with him, Sahachiro Hata, was retesting some of the earlier compounds. And he found that compound number 606 actually did work effectively against syphilis in infected rabbits and then in humans.
Compound 606, Salvarsan 606 it was called, wasn't it?
That's right, Salvarsan 606. It became the world's first magic bullet, the first chemical deliberately designed and proven to target and cure a specific bacterial infection.
So its significance wasn't just curing syphilis, but proving the whole concept.
Exactly. It showed that targeted chemotherapy was possible. It wasn't an antibiotic in the modern sense. Antibiotics come from living microorganisms like molds. Salvarsan was a synthetic chemical, but it was a massive breakthrough. It encouraged the search for other chemical cures like Prontosil, which led to the first sulfur drugs, and really paved the way towards the antibiotic revolution that came a bit later with Fleming and penicillin.
Wow, what an incredible period of change we've covered. It really is a revolution, isn't it?
Absolutely. Going from blaming bad smells and thinking life just spontaneously generated in decay, all the way to understanding specific germs, developing vaccines, performing relatively safe surgery with anesthetics and antiseptics, and governments finally accepting they had to provide clean water and sanitation. It's staggering progress in just a few decades.
Yeah, the pace of change in the 19th and early 20th century is just phenomenal. And you can see how interconnected it all was. Pasteur's work leads to Lister, supports Snow, Koch builds on Pasteur, develops methods others use, inspires Ehrlich.
Exactly. It's this interplay between key individuals, Pasteur, Koch, Snow, Lister, Simpson, Chadwick, Bazalgette, Ehrlich, and the broader scientific understanding that's developing, plus shifts in government thinking, sometimes pushed by things like epidemics or even war. It all comes together.
And for your GCSE studies, understanding those connections is so important, isn't it? Seeing how one breakthrough enabled or even created the need for the next one. Recognizing the challenges too, the resistance to new ideas, the technological limits, the initial reluctance of governments to act.
Definitely. It's not just a list of names and dates. It's about understanding the process of change, the different factors involved: science, individuals, government, war, communication, public pressure, and how they interacted to lay the foundations for the medicine and public health we have today.
It's a complex but really fascinating story. So maybe a final thought to leave you with.
Go on.
Well, think about scientific discoveries or new ideas about health today. Maybe things related to diet or the environment's impact on health, or even cures for diseases we still struggle with, like dementia or certain cancers. Do you ever see parallels? Do new ideas sometimes face resistance, like germ theory did? Does it take time for evidence to build up and for society or governments to fully accept and act on new knowledge?
That's a really interesting point. Does history repeat itself in how we respond to new health challenges and scientific understanding?
Yeah. What does this whole story we've just explored tell us about how progress in health actually happens, even now? Something to definitely think about.